Thank you everyone for being here. Welcome. I know there's other things you could be doing tonight, so we're very grateful for you to be here for our speaker series, the Menard Family George Washington Forum. I'm Court Rodet. I'm the director of GWF, as we like to call it, and associate professor of economics. I want to recognize those who make our speaker series possible, the Menard family, of course, the Phil and Pat Muck family as well as the fine folks in our business service center who help us arrange travel and whatnot, and of course, Cameron Dunbar, our program coordinator, who helps with everything and contributes to our programming. I also want to recognize the leadership and service of Professor Ryan Flugum, who has joined us this year, first year at Ohio University as the Muck Family Chair in Finance. And I think the students would agree, our fellows would agree, that we very much appreciate his dedication to the programming and planning of what we do. I also want to recognize our undergraduate fellows. Sincerely, it's a joy to work with you guys on a regular basis. It makes teaching worthwhile, so I appreciate you guys and all you do. So we're very lucky to have Professor Penelope Ismay here with us tonight. We connected with her last year in our capstone trip to Boston. And part of our programming, we do a trip at the end of the year where we meet with very special scholars in different places who lead discussions on all sorts of different topics that may or may not relate to our curriculum for the year. But it's a great opportunity to meet new people, study new things, and so on. And we had a great seminar with Professor Ismay on some of the regulations, norms, and things that came about as the British economy was changing due to the Great Enrichment and the industrialization related to the finance and banking sector and means of keeping people in check and their greed in check, which is related to the topic we're going to hear tonight. So very happy to have her here. Professor Ismay is an award-winning author and historian of trust and greed in modern Britain. She's an associate professor of history and director of undergraduate studies and director of undergraduate engagement at Boston College, and teaches courses on early modern and modern Britain and its empire, revolution and social trust in modern Europe, money and credit, women and work, marriage and family, and sociability and associational life. So her first book, Trust Among Strangers, focused on how the concept and practice of friendly societies helped 19th century Britons develop new forms of trust in a world increasingly populated by strangers. Her new book, The Boundaries of Self-Interest in Modern Britain, examines how Britons struggled, and often unsuccessfully, to keep self-interest from morphing into greed. So her talk today will focus on one especially unsuccessful episode. Please help me give a warm welcome to Professor Ismay.
Thank you, Court. Thank you all for coming tonight, and I wanted to express my gratitude to Andrew and the fellows of the George Washington Forum who came to Boston last year, because our very rich discussion was, you were so insightful, and it really helped me rethink the way I was approaching my topics. So thank you for that. And thank you all for coming. This is a work in progress, so I'm really excited to hear your thoughts and questions. Okay. I'm going to focus on an episode where the greed of one group of individuals put the lives of tens of thousands of the most vulnerable members of British society in danger. In this case, it was the greed of the cotton mill owners in the early Industrial Revolution. And I'm going to argue that the state attempted to curb that greed with legislation that we now talk about as the Factory Acts. We do not normally think of the Factory Acts as a response to greed. In fact, we normally think of this period as the moment when the British state got out of the business of moralizing the economy. We usually explain the Factory Acts as a rational response to the growing pains of a new industry, or a humanitarian response to the hazardous conditions of early factories, to the health and shortened lives of laborers, and to the public health problems factories posed to those towns that they were near. Addressing these social consequences was definitely part of the story of the Factory Acts. But what I will argue tonight is that if we keep our focus on the way the acts were talked about at the time as a means of curbing greed, we will be in a better position to answer some of those historiographical questions about early industrialization and modernity that continue to vex us. Scholars have described the period between 1770 and the 1830s as the moment when Britain abandoned the traditional moral economy. The moral economy was an agreed upon system of reciprocity. This is the E.P. Thompson and Carl Polanyi's story you might be familiar with. The moral economy was an agreed upon system of reciprocity where the state ensured the rich redistributed some of their wealth to the poor through a number of different mechanisms. There were price caps on bread. The poor laws were the absolute most important institution in this capacity, and a whole host of legal protections that between laborers and their employers that regulated that relationship. The poor, in turn, worked hard and showed deference. Starting in the late 18th century, scholars tell us, the state allowed the market to do the work of distributing resources, leaving the poor and the powerless to fend for themselves. This is a strange argument on a number of fronts. The idea that Parliament adopted a laissez-faire ideology makes it difficult to explain the massive and unprecedented growth of the state in that same period. The Factory Acts have long stood out in that story of laissez-faire because they initiated much of the state growth. But more to the point, they were a direct intervention in the market. Scholars have variously called them an exception to laissez-faire, an adjustment to the growing pains, or part of a transition. I think the reason the Factory Acts stand out is because the framework of laissez-faire on the one hand and state intervention on the other is the wrong way to think about this period. If we return to the moral economy framework that Britons at the time invoked, it'll help us make sense of the rise of the market economy and the growth of the British state. We often forget that the period of early industrialization was also what Boyd Hilton called the Age of Atonement. And it was in this context that the two Factory Acts I will examine tonight were passed. The first response when the 1802 Factory Act was introduced in Parliament, the very first act. The first response makes this context very clear. Lord Belgrave said, "Wealth was pursued in this country with an eagerness to which every other consideration was sacrificed, and with excesses calculated to call down the vengeance of heaven if the legislature did not put a stop to them." His phrase, vengeance of heaven, was not a rhetorical flourish. The reign of terror in France, fears of domestic insurrection, war, the threat of invasion, Napoleon promised to invade over and over, the grain scarcity, and Malthus's essays in the 1790s gave way in the 1810s and 20s to further apocalyptic fears concerning revolution, invasion, blockade, food shortage, national debt, a mad king, and a general apprehension that England was about to be singled out for divine punishment. As Malthus made clear in his essays on population, or his essay on population in 1798, God's punishments usually took the form of disease, famine, and war. The cholera epidemic of 1832 convinced even the doubters that Britain was in danger. The 1833 Factory Act and the acts to abolish slavery passed in that same year were both talked about as acts of atonement for the twin sins of greed and slavery. My argument is this. Britons saw realigning the moral and market economy was key to avoiding future divine displeasure. State legislative interference in the economy in Britain had long worked to align the market with the moral economy. The Factory Acts were part of this tradition, but the market that they were trying to moralize was new. The cotton textile industry was the fastest growing sector of the British economy in the late 18th century. The methods of producing cotton yarn and cloth were new and rapidly changing, and the profits that the cotton manufacturers reaped, at least at the beginning, were unprecedented. The Factory Acts were an attempt to attach that new wealth to appropriate social responsibilities. That is to say, to get the moral economy and the market back in sync. Okay, so I briefly described the moral economy as a system of reciprocity where the material resources of a society are distributed according to a certain set of principles. But the term moral economy gets used and misused, I think, in a lot of debates about the advent of modernity. So I'd like to elaborate a little bit on that before turning to the factory legislation. Most commonly, the term moral economy is used as a critique of market economy. So the term itself carries its own moral baggage. Moral economy is good, market economy is bad. I want to leave aside this moral evaluation. A moral economy and a market economy are simply two different methods for distributing the resources of a society. At the same time, I want to recenter greed as a moral problem for both moral and market economies. Notwithstanding our own ambivalence, greed has been considered bad across historical contexts. Greed is defined as the insatiable desire for more, and specifically more than one needs or deserves. It is an evaluative language that marks the outer limit of any moral economy. A greedy person disrupts the fair distribution of resources. Condemnations of greed work to bring that person's actions back into line with the dictates of the moral economy. Obviously, the danger of greed is most acute when resources are scarce. But sociologists have shown that the perceived fairness of a system of reciprocity promotes trust. And that trust is what keeps people content, or relatively content, with their lot. Greed can erode trust and can result in a correction to the distribution of resources that nobody wants, that is, social revolution. So I want to take you through the early history of the ways greed was talked about in the Christian tradition, both because that's what the late 18th and early 19th century parliamentarians and reformers were drawing on, and because the scarcity of resources that marked these early Christian communities will bring into stark relief the danger that greed poses to a moral economy. Okay, I have to issue a warning. I'm about to say the words, the Christian communities of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages. But before I do, I just want to assure you that I'm only spending about a paragraph for every 500 years. So we're just going to tip on the highlights. Don't worry. I dropped the whole invention of purgatory in the 14th century. So if anyone wants to talk about that in the Q&A, I would love to answer questions about that. Okay. So the Christian communities of late antiquity and the early Middle Ages had the easiest time dealing with greed. They believed that the end of the world was imminent and that the rejection of worldly goods was the key to salvation. So greed, which involved an obsessive fixation on worldly goods, was bad. Greed caused spiritual death. As one scholar put it, the avaricious have given themselves up to another, a demonic power, and have thus cut themselves off from God and the spiritual ideals of Christianity. God's impact on society was just as dire. Greed's impact on society was just as dire. Greed was seen as a form of idolatry, loving worldly goods above God. Nothing ignited God's anger like idolatry. He took his anger out on the whole community. Greed was so bad for the individual and the community, it was thought to hasten the day of God's judgment, bringing about the end of the world faster than it was already on track to end. It was in this early Christian context that greed became included among the deadly sins. It was named not just the root of all evil, but as one 5th century poet put it, the root, the cause, the head, the fount, and the origin of evil. You know, just in case anyone was confused. Greed led to every other sin, so it's really, really bad. As the imminence of the world's destruction faded in the 4th and 5th centuries, Christian thinking shifted from a total rejection of worldly goods to a just distribution of them. What was considered fair distribution of resources, of course, changed over time, which means that the lines around greed changed over time. How much was too much depended on how much there was to go around. Christian thinkers in this period began highlighting the spiritual benefits of redistributing goods through charity. In addition to not going to hell, the rich could even reduce the spiritual penalty that their wealth incurred on Judgment Day by giving to the poor while they still could. The money that started circulating steadily again in the 10th and 11th century posed a new problem for the Christian moral economy. The redistribution of material and spiritual goods in a non-moneyed economy had been reinforced by the fact that the goods were visible and perishable. The laborers who harvested the grain and put it in the silo of the rich man knew where it was. The rich man who refused to redistribute some of his grain would lose them eventually to rot or riot. So even without all the spiritual and social penalties, greed was both dumb and difficult to get away with in this context. But when the rich man began paying laborers for their labor with money rather than grain or in kind, a whole new can of greedy worms got opened. More people were getting rich in new ways, and their greed could be hidden from public view. In response, Christian writers unleashed what the great medieval scholar Johann Huizinga called a furious chorus of invectives against the vice. Greed became synonymous with avarice or the love of money, and in the mid-12th century, John of Salisbury declared that there was no worse vice than avarice. Instead of a subset of pride in the deadly sin list, greed got slotted into the pole position as the deadliest of the deadly sins. And once again, history was used as a warning. Greed caused the downfall of earlier golden ages. It'll bring the end of our own. But such invectives and warnings didn't chase money or greed out of Europe. As the commercial revolution of the late medieval period continued, Christian thinkers shifted from simply condemning greed, although they continued to do that as well, to figuring out how to make money and money-making okay in the moral economy. The question sparked intense debate. How much should the lord of the manor pay his laborers? Should their wages be connected to the price of bread? Should the price of bread be capped so that laborers could afford to eat? What about other prices? And how much was too much when it came to the profit of a merchant? Buying and selling had always posed a moral problem for Christian thinkers, because to buy something for one price and then turn around and sell it for a higher price was lying, cheating, and theft. This is something I have a lot of business students in my class. They find this part really surprising. In this tradition, the merchant was by definition greedy. As Thomas Aquinas put it, trade is justly deserving of blame because considered in itself, it satisfies the greed for gain, which knows no limit and tends to infinity. Some of the greatest minds of the late medieval and early Renaissance period were put to work on how to accommodate buying and selling in the Christian moral economy. In a moneyed economy, everyone engaged in trade to some extent. Christian thinkers made distinctions between honest and dishonest merchants, between those seeking a modest profit to support a family, which was good, and those who wanted to accumulate riches for riches' sake, which was very bad. The ideal limit on profit was that which enabled a merchant to support a family and also have some left over for charity. So you can see the structure of inequality was retained, but the money was moralized. For those who insisted on making immodest profits, restitution could be made by channeling those riches toward the building of churches, almshouses, hospitals, schools, and the like. In fact, some of the most beautiful cathedrals in Europe which are adorned with sculptures depicting the fate of a greedy man's soul as he is dragged to hell by the bag of gold wrapped around his neck. That guy. Some of these cathedrals were attempts to moralize wealth. In any case, you can see a pattern here. Material wealth incurred a moral, spiritual, and social obligation to redistribute some of that wealth to those in need. It was enforced by the moral language used to talk about the good of charity and the bad of greed. That doesn't mean people were not greedy. It just means it mattered when they were. This continued to be the case in the early modern period and got powerful reinforcement from two news sources: the Elizabethan Poor Laws and the rise of the credit economy. In the early 17th century, the Poor Laws took the distribution of charity out of the hands of individuals and the church and institutionalized it through the parish. The Poor Laws have gotten a lot of bad press, and they deserve a lot of bad press, but they effectively taxed the property of the rich and gave that relief to the poor for over 200 years. The second source that reinforced the moral economy in the 17th century was the expansion of personal credit relations. What Craig Muldrew calls an economy of obligation entailed vast webs of interconnected personal credit relationships based on little more than the word of the borrower and the trust of the lender. From the IOU uttered in a pub between neighbors to the bills of exchange that connected the merchants in London to the merchants in the Atlantic world, the credit economy both relied upon and intensified the Christian moral economy. Let me give you a sense of the ethics that kept credit circulating. Credit networks in local parishes were maintained through acts of neighborliness, which both signaled the parishioners' reputation for trustworthiness and helped keep credit flowing when the serial repayment of debt got interrupted. So it became a form of mutual aid. As Muldrew explains, the trustworthiness of neighbors came to be stressed as the paramount communal virtue, just as trust in God was stressed as a central religious duty. Christian ethics, like the practice of stewardship, helped to reinforce credit relationships. As Deborah Valencia explains, gaining money and giving it away represented opposite sides of a balance sheet of spiritual accounting. The wealth that Christians accumulated was part of the common stock bestowed by God, devolving upon the individual in much the same way as a long-term loan, with strings attached. The fabric of the credit economy was quite fragile, but ensuring that people kept their promises was made easier by the stakes involved. Preachers still railed about the spiritual punishments awaiting the dishonest or the greedy creditor, but the material punishments were quite effective on their own. One default or dishonest act, or even rumor of it, could destroy a merchant's reputation and have a cascading effect on everyone in the network. So on the one hand, greed was the norm in terms of allowing more time for repayment, and on the other, reprisals were swift and exclusion from credit networks could be catastrophic for the individual. A merchant who insisted on prompt repayment regardless of the debtor's ability to pay was considered greedy because he was putting his desire to hold cash above the social importance of circulating it. Greed was not good for a system that involved deep social interdependence. It was in this context that Adam Smith could say that following one's self-interest without thinking about the common good was okay. It was in everyone's self-interest to act in trustworthy, honest, non-greedy ways. In a way, moral philosophers like Smith and other thinkers in the Scottish Enlightenment were doing similar work to the theologians of the Middle Ages, working to explain how the self-interest that produced wealth could at the same time be morally sound. They didn't need to invoke hell or salvation because the Christian moral system of early modern England was fully integrated into the credit economy. As Smith put it in his theory of moral sentiments, ordinary men's self-interest was constrained by their need for the approval of others. Many scholars have made this clear, but it bears repeating that Adam Smith was not saying greed is good. And Bernard Mandeville, a writer who was writing a couple decades early, did say greed is good. And I think the difference in the reception between the two is worth noting because it was so stark. Smith's Wealth of Nations received what scholars call a warm reception, although apparently nobody actually read the book. There was one guy that they're certain read the book in the 19th century, but that's another story. It was warmly received. Mandeville wrote a book called The Fable of the Bees in 1723, and it was subtitled Private Vices, Public Benefits. So he was saying greed is good. That was one of the vices he thought was good. The response was, in France, his book was ordered burned by the public hangman. In Britain, the book was declared a public nuisance, and due to its direct tendency to the subversion of religion and civil government. And another commentator, who was an anonymous commentator, but the quote is so good, I just have to read it because it's apt. He said about Mandeville's book, the publication of such tenets as these, an open, avowed proposal to extirpate the Christian faith and all virtue, and to fix moral evil as the basis for government, is so stunning, so shocking, so frightful an enormity, that if it should be imputed to us as a national guilt, the divine vengeance must inevitably fall upon us. So yeah, in the 18th century, greed was not good, and it was not good to say that greed was good. Okay, so what happened in the early cotton industry that allowed greed to escape the moral bounds of the credit economy and the moral economy? I'm not blaming it all on this guy, but a lot of it is due to this guy. Okay, I'm going to answer this question by focusing on this single example. Sir Robert Peel, 1st Baronet, a title he not incidentally bought for £10,000. Robert Peel is an especially apt example because he is one of those early cotton lords who reaped enormous profits partly by refusing to submit to the dictates of the moral economy. But he was also the MP who sponsored the first Factory Act in 1802. He's gone down in history as a great humanitarian for supporting legislation that would reduce his profits. Was he making restitution for his sins by sponsoring this act? The short answer is no. He may have been seeking approval of his peers, but by that point, his greedy deeds had already been done. Let me give you the longer answer so you can see how he evaded the dictates of the moral economy. First of all, I want to focus on the profits that he made. And it's true that the Great Takeoff, we don't place the Great Takeoff in the 1770s anymore, but for some people, it absolutely was a great takeoff. And for the Peel family, it definitely was. So his father, also called Robert Peel, very unhelpfully for the historian, is the one who got the family firm off the ground with several timely innovations. This family just lucked into the timing at every turn in calico printing. But it was his son, Robert Peel, this guy, who took it to the next level. His father had given him 500 pounds, and with that first 500 pounds in the 1770s, Peel put it to work vertically integrating all aspects of his cotton textile manufacturing and calico printing works, exploiting every advantage in production, fashion trends, and sale. He even got an act of parliament repealed to help him. By 1787, his annual profits reached 50,000 pounds. By 1790, he was clearing 70,000 pounds a year. And by 1799, the Peel family was the 7th wealthiest family in Britain, and Robert Peel was one of only 10 millionaires. Peel, unlike many of his contemporaries, however, did not moralize his conspicuous wealth through conspicuous acts of charity. His own nephew, Lawrence Peel, said that he loved money. And then he qualified it by saying, but he loved it principally as an instrument of power. And I'm not sure that makes it better. And power he got. Instead of charity, Peel gave the vast majority of his wealth to his son during his lifetime and after. And his son, also called Sir Robert Peel, but this one the second baronet, became the longest standing prime minister in British history. So power. The Methodist preacher John Wellesley met Peel at his home for breakfast one morning in 1787. Afterwards, he exclaimed, "With that kind of wealth, what a miracle if he lose not his own soul." Okay, I just have to show you his houses. That's the house he was born in. This is his father's house. It's a substantial house. That's the house he had built. Pretty nice, much nicer than the first one. This is the house that his money helped his son build. Not even a house, like it's a manor. It's a manor. Okay, so Peel was super rich. But why was he able to evade the strictures of the moral economy for so long? Why didn't the social vigilance of the credit economy detect his greed? The answer to this part of the question is geography. Arkwright's mills needed fast and steady water sources, which were mostly found in remote mountain valleys. The difficulty that Peel and other manufacturers who used Arkwright's invention faced was how to attract laborers to their mills. And a lot of commentators talked about this at the time. In this period, most families would not allow their children to work in mills because they were new and they were dark and they didn't like them. So cotton lords cast about for a reliable source of labor and started asking parishes if they could take their pauper children off their hands. From 1770 to the 18 teens, 20,000 children, some as young as 5 years old, were apprenticed to cotton manufacturers. Most came from London and others, other big centers of population. Peel apprenticed 1,000 of these apprenticed children in his mills. Now, before you put a mental check in the good guy or stewardship column for Peel, let me put Peel's employment of pauper apprentices in context. Traditional pauper apprenticeships were fully ensconced in the moral economy. They were a form of charity. Historians have shown that it was a common practice reaching back to the 16th century for workhouse officers to apprentice poor children whose parents were either dead or could not support them. Normally, poor children would be apprenticed with a master of a trade who lived in the parish, and the child would then live in the master's house. These apprenticeships were understood as poor relief, and like other forms of poor relief, parish apprenticeships were governed by regulations that could be enforced by parents if they were still alive, or parish officers or magistrates. Masters received an upfront fee of usually £5, which really didn't cover what they were giving these children. And while the child might prove useful in the master's trade, such apprenticeships were usually a burden on the master because they were required to feed, clothe, and house their charge, as well as train the child up in a trade so that they might be able to support themselves in adulthood. It was poor relief to the local poor, an obligation that one that parish officers could even force on unwilling masters. So it was well within the moral economy. While parish apprenticeships to cotton masters followed the early tradition in a lot of ways, there were some significant differences. Rather than 1 or 2 children bound to a master, cotton masters took children in groups of 10 or 12 and lodged them en masse in apprenticeship houses. While some training was involved to teach the children how to clean the spinning machines, not without stopping the spinning machines, mind you, and to piece the thread, that was their main job. The work the children did would never prepare them to set up independently as cotton spinners or weavers. And in a large number of cases, the work caused permanent physical damage to their bodies and ability to work at all, which meant that they would be cast back on poor relief at the end of their short working life. Unlike traditional parish apprenticeships, the cotton masters transported children sometimes hundreds of miles away from their home parish, With no oversight from anyone legally obligated to care for these dependent children, they were at the mercy of the good graces of the mill owner. Peel used the lack of oversight to his advantage. He had what one observer called recourse to an expedient that would produce the possibility of unlimited profit, and he took it. He worked his 1,000 apprentice children in shifts of 14 to 15 hours that ran through the night. That was the recourse to the unlimited power. They ran the machines all night, every night. They slept 2 to a bed and shared that bed with 2 other children who worked the other shift. They were not given a change of clothes, as most apprenticeships required, and they were not given the opportunity or facilities to bathe. They had little time to eat and none for recreation. The conditions of the factories were even worse. Because cotton spinning requires humidity to keep the threads from parting when they were under tension, the windows and doors of these mills were kept closed. The air was full of cotton, particulate matter, the walls covered in grime, and the privies were overflowing. Lest you think I'm exaggerating for effect, Peel admitted everything I just said, these deplorable conditions, on the public record. And it was on the public record because not long after he opened his Radcliffe mill in 1780, these deplorable conditions created a public health hazard. In 1782, an outbreak of typhus fever infected many of his apprentices. The threat to public health inspired a group of respectable residents to go to the magistrates to do something to stop it. This is exactly how the local moral economy worked. The magistrates, in turn, asked a number of eminent doctors to investigate the mill. The doctors did so and then reported on their findings. While they couldn't determine if the outbreak had started in the mill, they were decided, in their opinion, that the disorder had been supported, diffused, and aggravated by the ready communication of contagion to numbers crowded together, by the accession to its virulence from putrid effluvia, that's a great word, and by the injury done to young persons through confinement and too long continued labor, to which several evils the cotton mills have given occasion. The structure of that sentence is like, what is my question for all of these quotes is, who is the subject of that verb? They were careful with their language, I think on purpose, so as not to sully the name of the richest man in town, but the message was clear. When Peel did not respond to the doctor's report, the magistrates then tried to contact him directly. Peel, the man who history knows as a humanitarian, refused to acknowledge any responsibility for the outbreak or for the poor conditions in his mills. The magistrates had no choice but to exercise the power the law allotted them. Again, this is how the moral economy was supposed to work. The magistrates were empowered to deal with breaches in the fabric economy through social and moral means. Accordingly, they passed a resolution to refuse to allow indentures of parish apprentices whereby they shall be bound to owners of cotton mills and other works in which children are obliged to work in the night and for more than 10 hours in the day. They ordered this notice to be transmitted to the clerks of the surrounding counties, and they had it printed in all the public newspapers. So here again, this is an escalation. This censure was public, and it was a big deal. It should have been a big deal, and it had no effect. Peel issued a counter-narrative in the local papers, denying everything. The local medical community then took matters into their own hands, using their expertise and social credit to try and pull Peel's and other cotton mill owners into the moral economy. They formed the Manchester Board of Health in 1795 to address the conditions in Peel's factory. And they then asked Peel to present a bill in Parliament that took their recommendations into account, which he did. He took their recommendations nearly point by point. What is so surprising about the point-by-point replication of the doctor's recommendation in 1802 in the Act was the fact that the typhus outbreak that led to the Act started in 1782. It became the subject of a very public controversy in 1784 and continued to be in the public eye, with subsequent epidemics hitting the same mill through the early mid-1790s. The doctors who made the original report had in the intervening time worked to create a public health structure for Manchester, raising large sums of money for protecting the community from the diseases from the cotton mills. They finally grew so exacerbated with their refusal on the part of the cotton masters, and particularly Peel, to comply with simple preventative measures to reduce the potential contagion, they finally called for this Act of Parliament and for Peel to sponsor it. And I don't have direct evidence of this, but my sense is that they put a lot of moral pressure on Peel to bring this bill. In any case, the 1802 Act to prevent the dangers to public health was introduced 20 years after the precipitating cause, and it should be noted, 3 years after Peel became a millionaire. Peel was not ignorant of the dictates of the moral economy. He even manipulated the expectations when he brought the bill into Parliament. He began by stating the great public service that cotton manufacturers did their communities by providing employment to the poor. And employment was understood as a form of charity. This was the good that the employers were doing for their community. It was well known, Peel said, that the cotton manufacturer gave employment to a great number of children of both sexes. In other words, look at the charitable acts I'm doing. When discussing the problem that the bill was addressing, he switched to the passive voice. The advantages, however, resulting from such good works on the part of cotton manufacturers were accompanied by a considerable evil. What was the evil? To answer this, Peel switches into a conjectural tone in the past conditional. I'm not sure that's actually right, but you'll see. He also uses a passive voice. Okay. It would easily be believed that where a large number of persons were crowded together, impurity would arise, and that impurity would be followed by disease. The object of the bill, he went on, was to establish regulations for the purpose of removing the evils complained of. Another object of it also was to give the poor children instruction, the want of which had given rise to much immorality. So Peel didn't say explicitly, but very clearly implied that these dirty, disease-prone, immoral children and their crowding together caused the terrible conditions in his cotton mills. His colleagues were not confused about the culprit, nor about what needed to be done. Belgrave's warning about greed, calling down the vengeance of heaven if the legislature did not put a stop to them, was heeded. In 1802, the act was passed into law with very little discussion and no resistance. But the law, which drew on the strictures of the old moral economy and simply stated them loud and clear, did not curb Peel's own greed. From 1802 until 1816, Peel, by his own admission, did nothing to improve the conditions in his mills. He allowed night work to continue. He did not reduce the hours the children worked. He did not see to either ventilation or cleanliness. He did not educate the children. These were the stipulations of his own law. In 1816, he once again asked for a bill to regulate the labor of children in cotton mills, and he chaired the committee convened to investigate the need for such a bill. During the course of the interviews, the committee learned from sworn testimony that a resolution had been passed in the county of Warwick, located 133 miles away from Manchester, that no pauper children from Warwick were allowed to be apprenticed to Peel's mills. Not to cotton mills in general, but to Peel's mills. Upon learning this in 1816, the committee put Peel in the hot seat. He tried to deflect, but finally admitted that nothing had changed in his mill between 1802, when he brought a bill to Parliament to stop such conditions, and 1816 when he introduced a new bill to stop such conditions. Why, the committee reasonably wanted to know, did Peel need an act of Parliament to alter the conditions in his own mill? Peel deflected again. Everyone was doing it, he said. I mean, if my 16-year-old said that to me, I'd be like. Later, he added that he had so many business concerns he could not be everywhere at once. But that was precisely what Peel was known for. He was called a man of untiring energy with an iron will who ran his mills with a discipline that approached military drill. He superintended every aspect of his mills in the early days, as he admitted to the committee, stating that, quote, "No part of my business escaped my attention." And according to his own testimony, he witnessed the impact of the working conditions of his mill on the apprentice children in his care. Quote, "I was struck with the uniform appearance of bad health and in many cases stinted growth of the children in my mill." So he knew about the conditions and allowed them to continue. Okay, admittedly, I'm belaboring this point a bit, but I have a point. Just like in 1802, in 1816, no one was confused on the committee as to the cause for the conditions. It was greed, pure and simple. Even Peel pointed his finger at greed. It should be known to the committee, he said, that at that time the profits arising from the machinery of Sir Richard Arkwright were so considerable that it frequently happened that the machinery was employed the whole 24 hours. Once again, passive voice. Who was the person who ran that machinery and the children connected with it 24 hours a day? At long last, Peel provided a clear answer. He explained that the long hours the children worked were regulated by the interest of the overseer, whose remuneration depended on the quantity of work done. The overseer, Peel continued, was often induced to make the poor children work excessive hours and to stop their complaints by trifling bribes. Who induced the overseers this way? The committee asked. Peel was done answering questions. Even though I'd love to continue to beat up on Peel, what matters for my argument is that Peel and his contemporaries saw greed as a precipitating cause that made parliamentary interference necessary. They also saw the 1802, the 1816, and subsequent factory acts that they passed in order to curb greed as ineffective. And the reason for this is because they were using old mechanisms on what was, in fact, a new problem. It took a new mechanism in the form of the factory inspectorate to provide the effective limits on greed and to realign the market and the moral economy. And I'm just going to briefly touch on the 1833 Act, nearing the finish, as a way to talk about how the moral and the market economy got realigned. I want to end by highlighting the way people at the time talked about the effectiveness of the 1833 Act, which introduced the inspectors. And this act was talked about then and now as an effective act. It was the first effective act, and it was because of the factory inspectors. Several legislative acts had been passed in the interim between 1802 and 1833, as I said, and they were openly violated. This was in part due to the fact that the steam engine, which was more common in the 1830s, really increased the scope for greed. One factory inspector said, "A steam engine in the hands of an interested and avaricious master is a tyrant power." But it was partly due to the lack of enforcement of existing legislation. The penalty for violating the law was insignificant compared to the profits that could be made violating the law. The large manufacturers wanted to restrict the hours of labor. And this is another thing we often don't remember, is that the large manufacturers were the ones calling for this law and for the enforcement clause in this law. But they wanted it to be properly enforced. So the enforcement clauses in previous factory acts had drawn on the machinery of the traditional moral economy by empowering the magistrates to inspect the mills, but very few of them did. They had full-time jobs. And it was also frequently the case that the magistrate was either a relative of or a friend of the local mill owner. So they had a very serious conflict of interest. Not all of them recused themselves, but that's another story. The new law ensured that the factory inspectors would be disinterested parties. This is really significant. This is the whole civil reform of the civil service is predicated on this idea of disinterestedness. And disinterest was produced by paying a good salary and giving social status to the inspectors. But also the very first act that legislated these inspectors gave them enormous power. They were able to enter into the factory at any time without notice, into where the production was happening. And mill owners had effectively kept inspectors out for a long time because of trade secrets and that kind of thing. But so inspectors were allowed to go into where the production was happening. They were allowed to stop safety violations, stop work violations on the spot, and ask the mill owner to remedy them. They were allowed to make new regulations. So they actually legislated on the spot as they were going. And didn't have to wait for another act of Parliament, although they then influenced the subsequent acts of Parliament. They could prosecute offenders, and they did, when moral suasion didn't work. And they also delivered a report that was published in parliamentary papers and in the press twice a year. The first 4 inspectors and their band of sub-inspectors perambulated the nation, legislating from the edges of the moral economy, fixing misalignments between the moral and the market economy as they emerged. Their disinterest acted to enlighten the self-interest of the factory lords, even if the factory lords didn't want their self-interest enlightened. And the reports became a new channel facilitating the flow of information about the state of all aspects of industry from the periphery to the center. I want to make one final point. The Factory Acts I've focused on tonight were attempts to curb greed, but I'm not arguing that they actually stamped out greed. Factory owners continued to exploit workers in pursuit of more and more profit. The factory reports were full of such abuses. There's one that sticks up in my mind. I can't get it out. Factory inspector walked into a mill and saw legs dangling out of a sack and pulled the legs out, and there was a 7-year-old child shoved into the sack because they saw the factory inspector coming in and the mill owner was trying to hide him, because 7-year-olds after 1833 weren't allowed to work in factories anymore. There were many, many attempts to violate the law. Many, many more factory acts were passed to address these violations through to the 20th century. New scope for greed kept enlarging as new innovations, new markets, and new industries emerged. But here's the point. By all accounts, the 1833 Act succeeded in realigning the moral and the market economy by establishing a new normative basis for what was considered a moral profit. When a factory owner highlighted his own philanthropy, as they increasingly did in the 19th century, they had to put their money where their mouths were. They had to fulfill the obligations that wealth owed to the less fortunate through charity, which itself took on new forms. So friendly societies, savings banks, lending libraries, mechanic institutes, all sorts of new philanthropic activity was sponsored by industrial wealth. The normalization of wealth fulfilling its social responsibilities is clear in the words of a factory inspector from the 1870s who said, "The new factory legislation must be discussed very differently from the old days of the factory bill in 1833. It is no longer a battle of greed of gain against unremunerated labor. Manufacturers now recognize the well-known axiom that property has its responsibilities as well as its rights. The manufacturer is no longer the hard-hearted master whose ruling passion is avarice. He can dispense his wealth with liberality, and he is a generous contributor to those local objects of benevolence and usefulness." These might sound like hollow words to our jaded ears, but as the sociologist Quentin Skinner noted, the normative language into which people fit themselves and describe their actions is not simply a guise that hides their true intent. In Skinner's words, the normative vocabulary available to an agent for the description and appraisal of his conduct is at the same time to indicate one of the constraints on his conduct. An Elizabethan merchant cannot describe himself as religious unless his behavior actually conforms with what is considered religious in the 16th century. Likewise, if a factory owner wished to call himself benevolent after 1833, he could not allow others to call him greedy. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
I actually have two questions.
Okay.
First, could you contextualize the Luddites within Peel and his big books? I believe Peel's skills were one of them. Another areas of the Luddites attack. And secondly, based on your research, what do you hope policymakers and those who are trying to work to regulate the extreme wealth and inequality happening in contemporary society could learn from these attempts back in 18th and 19th
Yeah, Peel, so thank you for those questions. Peel definitely experienced machine breaking, and that's why he moved to Tamworth. I guess I don't have a picture of it, which was pretty remote. And the machine breaking is part of the moral economy. It was the right to have employment was part of a parish's obligations to the people who had rights to parish relief in the parish. So machine breaking fits into that system in the way I think of it. And to answer your other question, I mean, that is the question, right? That's the golden question. My sense is that, I started this talk in lots of different ways as I was trying to figure out how to frame it. I think that we don't really think greed is bad. And that's the difference, that when they said greed was bad, and I'm not just talking about the late antiquity to the early Middle Ages, but in the 19th century, to be called greedy was bad. This is interesting, to be called self-interested was bad. This is the most common adjective that went along with the term self-interest was sordid. So self-interest was not, this is the era, the 1770s to the 1830s is Malthus, not Smith. Smith isn't people, they know supply and demand, but they don't know anything else that he says until later in the 19th century. And they're not using him in policy in this period. It is a non-growth, static economy. So it isn't an optimistic period. This is where the dismal science gets attached to political economy. Andrew.
Right. So I had 2 points that I wanted to make.
Okay.
The first is maybe less directly relevant to this part of the project, but I think maybe more relevant in general. Although by the end, maybe there is a degree of relevancy, which is you mentioned the Scottish Enlightenment. Of course, we're contractually obligated to say something. But I think there's something really fruitful that can be sussed out here by noticing that the Scottish Enlightenment doesn't have one perspective on this, and there are pretty big differences between someone like Keynes, who is incredibly pro-charity, and someone like Smith, whose approach to charity is very interesting. When he says it's not by the benevolence of our butcher that we expect our meat, he's not saying that we're all greedy and it's horrible. He's saying this is a great victory, that I no longer have to care about the political leanings of my butcher to get my meat. That the market has basically freed us from arbitrary benevolence. For him, benevolence is a very specific meaning. It involves arbitrariness. It's one person's personal choice. So it's a positive thing that we move past charity. So on that front, Keynes is something like something similar to John Winthrop. It might be useful to think of it in that way, the model of Christian charity. While Smith is doing something very new that I think is worth teasing out there. On the second part, I'm curious, when I think of greed, I mean, obviously we think in its very moralistic terms now, but for people in the 18th century, greed had a very important political meaning, and it was a political problem for a specific political movement going all the way back to Thucydides, and that's democracy, right? Athens has this problem of always grasping for more. Milton has Moloch kind of acting as the democratic voice within the council of hellish peers at the beginning of book 2, Paradise Lost. And Smith is very concerned with this Republican critique of greed, right? He's trying to find ways to minimize the pernicious political effects of greed while harnessing its economic power. So I was wondering if your project is a space for the political problem of greed, right? Smith would not like Robert Peel being given political power.
Yeah,
that would be the core error for Smith.
That's a great question. Thank you for those comments. I think the politics that I'm interested in aren't the politics of party, because that's another thing about this period. It's such a weird period. Scholars have so much difficulty, putting it in a bucket. And you can't say it's humanitarians against utilitarian. Nothing really fits completely for especially for the Factory Acts. But the politics that I'm interested in is the stuff I touched on at the end, and that's the way the state grows into these officers who are, their power was extraordinary, and it got curtailed significantly, but they weren't subject to Parliament, and they weren't even put in the hierarchy of the Home Office. So they had this kind of, what kept them safe, what giving them all that power that kept them safe was this disinterestedness. And that structuring in. So the second half of my project looks at the civil service reform, and using, the way I think about it in a kind of macro sense, is the civil service as it gets reformed and they, figure out how to solve the problem of attracting talent without paying for it, right? Without attracting self-interest, that these people are doing it for the public good. And that has to do with, hierarchy, and there are lots of ways they square that circle. But disinterestedness is the thing they claim. And that's what offsets the greed of the market. And the factory inspectors are the very first instance of that.
Picking up on the point you're just making, it seems like our own moment is sort of an interesting moment in this question of the administrative state and civil servants, and the balance between that and democracy, and to what extent is the administrative state a fulfillment of democracy, to what extent it's a challenge to democracy. It seems like that is what is all over our news right now, is the tension between those two things. And I'm just curious about whether your story gives us any way to get our mind around that problem.
Just solve it all for us.
Yeah, I know. Does it? Well, let me. This is not an answer to your question, but I was going to put some emphasis on this, but I just want to show you this graph. It's an n-gram. Does everyone know what an n-gram is? They're so wonderful for just getting a snapshot. And this is kind of remarkable when you see, because does anyone know what was happening right here in the early 16th century? Reformation. Greed was a big problem then. And then you see our period. Talk of greed goes up, or avarice is the one. And then I put poverty in. And it's really interesting. I mean, these are just correlations. They're not, you have to read the books, right, that this is showing a frequency in. But it shows some really interesting relationships between talk of greed and talk of poverty, that greed is pulling out from the distribution of resources, so someone's not getting them. In terms of, I mean, what it's showing here is interesting, because talk of poverty is higher than it's ever been, and greed and avarice are down, which is interesting. I don't know what else to say about it. But I think in the administrations and the civil service before it was reformed in the 1850s was called corrupt. It was called, they used patronage, and they did. I mean, they weren't trained. Some people were just, they'd get £1,000 a year to sit and do nothing. And some of them were corrupt, so they were also stealing stuff. So there was a lot of corruption, but the administrative services like that, they go through those kinds of cycles, they get ossified. In this case, the corruption, what looks very much like corruption to us and did to the 1850s reformers, was also a way to solve the trust problem, which the post-1850 civil service had real difficulty with. The people who were in the civil service what's the word, nepos, right? They were all maybe that's not the right word. They were all the result of nepotism in some way, patronage. So, but they were all known. They were all vouched for. And even the corrupt ones, they could go to the person who vouched for them and say, dude, what? We need a new person who can actually run the Navy. So when the 1854, doesn't really happen in 1854, but it starts to happen with the Trevelyan report, Northcote Trevelyan report, they're trying to figure out how do we get qualified people, but vouch for their character as well. These people might be smart, but they're unknown. And how do we know them? How does a state know people who aren't part of the system? So I don't know, I'm just talking. I don't have an answer to your question. I'm sorry.
You clarify, towards the end you said there was a change in how the mill owners had to demonstrate their charity and make up for their wealth. Can you clarify how that came about? Was it because of the changes to the civil service and the checks on, they could no longer just employ boards of children and say, look, I'm being charitable. They had to actually live up to certain regulations and then demonstrate charity in sincere ways, or what was it?
Yeah, I mean, I think the civil service part is a small part of the story in this period. The bigger part of the story is that, and I didn't talk about, there was a parliamentary committee and a royal commission that led to the 1833 Act. And it just was a national sensation. So the Sadler's Committee, that's the one you learned about in school. That's the children being paraded of their broken bodies brought through Parliament, and so the whole thing was interviews of, and some of them were fraudulent. They paid one kid to say he had been an apprentice. He made the story up. So that was bad. But then the manufacturers had a royal commission, and they went and investigated not just their own mills all over the country, and they confirmed that the working hours were mutilating the bodies of children. And so that's where the law came in. So it became this kind of, it unified across party lines, across religious lines, a concerted kind of universal cry for reducing the hours of labor for children. But it's so complicated because you reduce the hours of labor for children, it necessarily meant you were reducing the hours of labor for adults. And the 10 hours movement wanted that. They wanted to stop, they didn't want to be working these hours either. And so there was that's where a lot of politics came into the story. But I think it was the exposure, the public exposure of this massive problem, that then if a mill owner wanted to be considered not just benevolent, but of that station, the station that he wanted his wealth. In Peel's case, he bought his station, right? He bought his seat in Parliament. He bought enough houses in the pocket borough he moved into to get a seat in Parliament, and then he bought his. He donated £10,000 to the government for the war effort and got a baronetcy in return. I think that was purchasing the title, but I think that people wanted, that's what the industrialists wanted, was that social status that the aristocracy had. And so it was important, and that's what constrained their behavior. So I think it just reset the social pressure on them.
I'm kind of interested in this chart, actually.
Okay.
In your judgment, so it appears that the use of greed and avarice has essentially flatlined over the past century.
Uh-huh.
Do you think that this is a result of a decrease in the frequency of behaviors we might describe by these terms, or do you think it's quite the opposite, that it's become increasingly commonplace and we've actually become.
That's a great question. So greed is a condemnation, right? There's nothing, you can't see it in other ways. No, and nobody calls themselves greedy. It's a social critique of a person's behavior. And so it's the condemnation of a certain kind of behavior. We don't condemn it anymore. We don't condemn it as much, maybe. I mean, certainly when the 2008 crisis happened, corporate greed there's a big spike there. It's not subtle. I could have zoomed in, but the corporate greed was named as the problem, but it didn't matter. It didn't change the way the system worked. It didn't have any impact on the people who were involved got bonus or paid themselves bonuses and then reinvested in the real estate market. So it doesn't have the same impact. And so I think to answer the first question that was asked, it is about the condemnation of greed having social effect, having meaning, that it matters to be called greedy.
Thank you for your talk. Very interesting. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the relationship of usury and greed, because I know that even as late as the Middle Ages, Thomas Aquinas, for example, is very critical of Christians engaging in usury, but it seems as though the kind of economy of greed and the dynamics of greed have detached themselves from the kind of emerging credit economy of the 17th century. So I was wondering if you could speak to that sort of disconnect, because I know that earlier Christian sources are that, like, usury is greed, right?
Yes,
They're deeply tied together.
Yeah. Well, but even in so in the 14th century, you start to get the same group of religious thinkers trying to figure out how to make money okay. I left out usury altogether because it's just a whole other greedy can of worms, as it were. But there were ways to think about usury. The sort of worst usury equals greed was, the way they described that was, you lend someone money and you ask for interest, you are stealing time. What you're taking is time and you're getting paid for it, and time is God's. And so you're stealing from God. So it's really bad. So that was one explanation for why, but there were lots of, as you're noting, the way it starts getting rationalized or accommodated is that they start to consider what a merchant does is transport goods from one place to another. That's work. So work becomes raised up. Work used to be seen as a punishment. It gets raised up in this period as a value, as something of value. So the merchant, the person who's lending his money is giving someone value and should be paid for that time, for the use of his money. But it should be very close to the cost of the loan itself. The other way that it got rationalized or accommodated was that they started to think about risk. And, England is right it's a maritime country, so the shipping and ships were always getting lost at sea, and the maritime insurance that starts to grow up really built on this idea of, these theologians were saying, well, risk is a kind of work, and so they should be paid for the risks that they're taking with their money. So usury does get accommodated in the earlier period, but what happens in the credit economy is after the financial revolution, when the state is the biggest debtor in Britain, and the people are the creditors, there's a new way of accommodating interest, and people are starting to, the entire financial economy is built on people wanting annuities or lottery tickets or pieces of the national debt because it gives them security in the future. So interest becomes something that provides security, and that starts to get moralized. But even in, so this is my favorite example of the insurance industry, is the very first Insurance Act was called the Gambling Act because it was understood, and that's why it was illegal for so long until 1774. It was illegal until 1774 because it was seen as gambling because you're just betting, you don't know. And you know, the sort of statistical revolution hadn't quite happened yet. So, and even when it had, people didn't believe it. God was in charge of what happens when, not numbers. So, did I answer your question? Sorry, I kind of like.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
More round of applause.
Yeah, thank you.